Rachel, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell the audience and myself a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So, my name is Rachel Gibson, and I am a director at the National Center for Victims of Crime. I work in the Center for Victim Service Professionals. And I tell people jokingly, but really, that I work with tattoo artists to say nurse, judges to court advocates, and everyone in between. Anyone who will support a victim of crime across their journey professionally. I work to provide technical assistance, training, resources, and help them make sure that they can better serve the victims and survivors that they work with in their community.
That's awesome. And how did you get into the field?
It was probably happenstance. My major in grad school was criminal justice, and I knew I was either going to go to law school or become a law enforcement officer. And when those two things didn't pan out, I needed a job. And I had a friend who connected me with the formerly known as the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And they were looking for a technology safety specialist. And she said, "You should apply. You like this topic." And I applied and got the job and have been doing gender-based violence and victims of crime work ever since, having experienced victimization as a child and as an adult, as well as helping friends as they have navigated their own victimization, really sort of wanting to do a career where I could be justice minded and work to make sure that those who are experiencing the criminal justice system get the support, get the resources, and get the justice that they want or deserve. Or the recourses doesn't always mean a penal recourse, but whatever that recourse looks like for them, it could be restorative justice or transformative justice. However that looks like, I wanted to be a part of that process. And so that's how I got started.
That's awesome. I think a lot of the people that I interview are on the side of prevention and maybe a little bit of the what to do after the fact, but there's usually, unfortunately, we don't have as many resources on how to recover, how to navigate that process elsewhere. And what is the name of the entity again that you work for?
Yes, so it's the National Center for Victims of Crime. And I love that you mentioned that prevention work, because I tell people all the time, we cannot have intervention strategies without prevention, and prevention can't do prevention without intervention. And so we all play a part
Yeah.
in the life cycle of someone's journey through a justice process. And so prevention and intervention must work together in order to sort of meet those goals.
Awesome. Do you know when the National Center for Victims of Crime was started and kind of what the original mandate or premise for it was?
Sure. So we were started over 38 years ago by the family of Sonny Von Bulow, who was a New York socialite. And that family experienced what many families experience through the justice system, which was a failure, which was a system that they thought was meant to protect and help and make sure that they got the justice that they deserved. And that system did not work for them. And so out of that pain, they helped to find resources and came up with the National Center for Victims of Crime. And so out of that work, we started doing a lot of policy work, helping to get the Victims of Crime Act uh, made. We work to do a lot of policy change, and now we currently do a lot of really great work where we support not only victim service professionals and those folks who are helping and supporting victims, but also doing some direct support to victims through our Victim Connect Resource Center, which is a helpline 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, where we provide chat, text, and talk to victims of crime. And one of the things that I think makes the National Center for Victims of Crime unique, or NCVC, is that we serve all victims of crime. And what does that mean? So we recognize that many victims are experiencing polyvictimization, or multiple types of crimes are happening at once, right? And so maybe I'm a victim of financial fraud, but I'm also experiencing intimate partner violence. Maybe I'm an older adult experiencing elder abuse, but also I'm experiencing identity theft or tax facilitated crimes or stalking or trafficking. And so often many victims of crime don't even recognize that they've been victimized, but know that something has happened. And so our Victim Connect Resource Center really does provide an open ear. Doesn't matter when, doesn't matter the date, doesn't matter the gender identity, doesn't even matter if they think they've been a victim, but think something has happened. That Victim Connect Resource Center is really dedicated to provide them with help. And so out of all of that, I say, that the National Center does a really good job of sort of connecting the dots in places where our more siloed based services may not have the ability or the expertise or the people power to sort of do that. And that's sort of what we bring to the field, is bringing that lens, bringing the voice of victims who are often pushed out of services, pushed out of resources because they don't fit the mold of what someone deems as a good victim, or they might be experiencing a victimization type that someone may not have expertise in. And so that's really something that we do really well here at NCVC, is making sure those victims' voices are heard.
And so are you providing the direct services, or are you kind of referring people out to specific entities that help with certain types of things?
Sure. So our Victim Connect Resource Center does do some of those advocacy, safety planning strategies, really sort of that first line of defense, really sort of helping that person figure out maybe what's happening, doing those conversations, and then they will do a warm referral to local based resources should that person want that. And then we also have our DC Victims Hotline, which is a 24-hour hotline, and that does a lot of the triaging for all of the crime types that folks are experiencing in the district. And so both of those helplines and hotline really do sort of, they're that initial sort of first phone call that people may make, and they really do a good job of supporting that person when they make that call.
A very good listening ear to get them on the right direction.
Exactly.
And so what is the specific work that you're doing in your field of interest?
Sure. And so I think what makes our work really unique is that we sort of tie it all together, right? And so I work with our victim service professionals. We have our Crime Victims Bar Association for attorneys that provide civil justice. We have our National Training Institute that does a national training for service providers. And then our Tribal Resource Center that works with victims of crime who are from tribal communities and supporting their tribal programs. And so all of our programs are connected in that way. And so out of the work that I do, I get to do what I consider really cool work, which is sort of helping folks who do victim services. They're the experts. They know what's happening in their communities. But my job is to really, again, support them and really sort of do the deeper dive that folks on the ground who are doing that day to day can't do. And so one of those projects is our Financial and Technology Crimes Initiative, where I work with several partners, one of which is the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, where we provide training to advocates. And when I say advocates, again, it could be a victim advocate, it could be a banker, it could be a teller, it could be anyone who is in a professional capacity. And we provide them with training, technical assistance, resource development. I have to put a plug in for our Taking Action Guide, which is for advocates working with victims of financial fraud. And so out of that work, I do a lot around supporting victims of not only just financial fraud, but exploitation, financial abuse, and making those intersections. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces that I have been focusing on, is helping folks recognize the intersection. So yes, I might be experiencing financial fraud, but if I am from a community of color, if I am if I am an older adult, if I'm a person living with a disability, that financial fraud crime could have significant impacts, not only just on my finances, but my well-being, because so much of our life is tied up in our partners, in our family members, our caregivers, our community. And so I spend a lot of time helping folks see that intersection as well, not only just with the financial pieces, but also the tech facilitated crimes piece, which is often connected now because most of our lives are happening online, right? And so connect and get back in that way. So that's one of the sort of big initiatives that I work on, as well as working with our Project Safe Neighborhoods, which is a Bureau of Justice Assistance project, which is working with law enforcement and prosecutors around violent crime reduction. And so that's another one where I think we spend a lot of time helping, not only sort of, again, one of the things that we sort of are working with is talking about trauma-informed services. And when we say trauma-informed services, people sort of use that language sort of freely, but really sort of thinking about how someone from start to finish can experience the justice system, and that experience could make or break someone as they sorry about that. I thought I had turned Slack off and I did not. So let me make sure I do that.
I'll make a note of this timeline here.
Thank you.
I didn't hear it though.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, I don't, it says in a meeting, I don't know why. There we go. It is now paused for 2 hours. Sorry about that. So what was I saying?
Trauma-informed services.
Yes. So when we talk about trauma-informed services, I always talk about that front door being open. And what's the front door? Not just the front door of your actual building, which if the accessible entrance to your front door is in the back of your office, that's a problem. If the website that you have isn't offered in multiple languages or someone's screen reader can't read it, that front door is not open. If when I walk into your organization and your organization is in a predominantly Black neighborhood, yet all of your staff are white, that's not a front door that's open. And so that first initial contact can make or break how someone experiences that justice system. And when we think about being trauma informed, we have to think about it from start to finish. And our goal is to really help law enforcement and prosecutors understand that when victims and survivors navigate the justice system, most often than not, this is the first time their victimization is the first time they've come into contact with law enforcement or prosecutors. And so they're going to have a lot of feelings, a lot of unpacked trauma that has happened. And so how do we help those first responders? How do we help prosecutors help someone understand that maybe their court case is going to take 6 to 9 months and we might have a continuance, we might have a delay, but that doesn't mean that your case is not important. And so really helping them navigate that. And so we are really sort of taking that lens, not only in that BJA project, but really in all the work that we're doing to really sort of help the system do better by victims and survivors.
Yeah, I can really imagine the experience of particularly from kind of the CSI and the TV cop show culture that we think justice is swift.
Yes, yes.
When reality is it's a very slow moving entity.
Yes, and especially when Olivia Benson can solve a crime in 30 minutes, right? and that's one of the things that I think makes victim advocates so important is that they normally will go through the process with the victim and a survivor. And so helping them understand that the process is going to be slow. And then when you bring in crimes like financial fraud or technology, when things are deleted or things have to be researched or money has to be traced or you're one piece of a bigger white collar crime sting, and really sort of helping victims and survivors understand that and navigate that. And I tell people all the time, one of the tools you can have is making a report. And a report doesn't necessarily mean to law enforcement. It could be to the FTC. We actually have a NCVC link to FTC reporting. And I tell survivors that maybe you don't want to sort of go to law enforcement, but you could report to the FTC. And when you make a report to the FTC, you actually may not get follow-up, but that does not mean that they are not listening and they are not taking that report and adding it to the cases that they're working with. And so that reporting, that sort of process, understanding what that looks like can be traumatic for victims and survivors. And so that is really important as we sort of help someone navigate what should be a trauma-informed justice process.
Is that some of the difficulty in getting people to report fraud and crime in general? Is that the process is not clear, simple?
Yes, that is
Right.
one of the major things. First of all, when we talk about financial fraud, especially, I there's a lot of behaviors that's similar to intimate partner violence and sexual assault, where these are types of crimes where we victim blame right out of the gate.
Yeah.
What were you wearing? Why did you stay? And why did you give them the money? Right? Those are sort of the narratives that people are hearing. And so if I experience financial fraud, and I hear my community, my friends say, well, you were dumb. You gave them the money. I've heard from many victims and survivors say that when they go to law enforcement has told them there's nothing we can do because you chose to give
Yeah.
them the money. And so many times you'll hear that victims and survivors will not report because they don't think they have an option, or they're shamed for quote unquote falling prey
Yeah.
to that. And one of the things that I really sort of talk with advocates about is to say we can't victim blame. Fraudsters and people who choose to perpetrate these types of crime are really smart.
Yeah.
And they're looking for people. And it's not to say that someone can be easy, but it is to say they're looking for folks who might be isolated. Well, in COVID times, most of us were isolated, right? So it doesn't necessarily matter sort of the age, because most people think that victims of financial fraud are older people. And that's not always necessarily true, but it is to say that they are often targeted. And I think that's what we have to talk about, is who is being targeted for these sorts of crimes and why. And then how do we help them identify it? And so we have in our training, we talk about really three sort of target populations, and we're bringing in more. One is older adults, because we recognize that they are often seen as senile or maybe experiencing dementia and Alzheimer's. Their friend group is dwindling, so they're isolated. They're not going to run things past their family and friends because they don't want to appear that they don't have their mental capacity.
Yeah.
And so we recognize that they're often targeted. We talk about victims of intimate partner violence. 99% of victims, as reported by the National Network to End Domestic Violence, said they will not leave their abusive relationship because they do not have the financial means to do so, right? But then we tell people, well, just leave. Well, it is expensive to live, and it's expensive for people to leave. And when they have children involved and houses involved and cars and life involved, just leaving when there are financial ties can be life or death for someone. And so, talking about that target population. And then lastly, thinking about those who are repeat victims. So I hear from folks all the time that say, well, how do we tell someone that they're being victimized and they don't want to believe it? And that's one of the struggles that I even struggle with. I have a close friend who is experiencing financial fraud, and I do this work. And I've talked to the person, their families talked to the person, the police has talked to the person, but they have built a relationship with that fraudster online that they feel like they're in this relationship and that this person is true. And so how do we help repeat victims who are being targeted, whose information is being sold to these sort of lists to keep them on the list, to, again, prey on folks who might be isolated from friends and family? And so those are sort of those target populations that we've been focusing on to sort of get the word out and help people sort of think through their strategies with supporting them.
So what? Let's dive in on that. For those that are repeatedly victims of financial fraud and kind of this progressive conveyor belt of crime, how do you connect with a person in order to help them to see what's going on?
Yes, and I think that's such a good point you made, was that connection. And one of the strategies that I talk about with folks is proving them wrong, right? how do you show that someone is defrauding them? Well, I tell people, if it's a romance scam, run their picture through reverse image search. Google is probably one of the most powerful tools out there. Google them, see if someone else, if that phone number comes up, put that phone number and see if that's a real legitimate phone number or if it's a spam phone number. A lot of our phones now have spam filters. And
Yep.
I actually got a call the other day and it said possible spam. So now I know not to answer that phone call, right? And so it's really connecting to people who can help them see that this is a fraud. But ultimately, it's really sort of, again, giving them the tools to make the best decision for themselves. And again, the similarities between intimate partner violence and this is that it takes an intimate partner violence victim 7 to 9 times
Oh,
before they'll leave. And I say the same thing can be true for folks who might be experiencing this sort of crime. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but we still have to give them that information and continue to work on them. And then when we think about working with folks who are most vulnerable, folks who might be older adults or living with disabilities, it's thinking about how do we support them while also, again, recognizing their bodily autonomy, but also recognizing that sometimes we have to come up with strategies like power of attorney, like mandated reporting that have to be done. And
mhm.
I'm not an advocate always for doing that because my goal is to say, how can we do everything we can do before we take that autonomy from someone? But that is an option and should be done with care and should be done with the person where appropriate and where you can.
Yeah, I've heard lots of discussions about, with aging parents is starting to, hey, is sharing with them, hey, I got this phone call,
Mm-hmm.
and I almost fell for this, as opposed to
Yes.
saying, hey, have you gotten this phone call? Why did you fall
Yes.
for this? But really turning it around and kind of sharing the experience as opposed to uh, attacking with the experience, so to speak.
Exactly. And I think the other piece is, are we safe people to report to? Will the person feel comfortable coming to you and saying, "Hey, this happened and it seemed weird." I tell people all the time, I do this work and often I have also been a victim of financial fraud, right? Like it doesn't just mean that an older adult or a person with a disability is more likely to be victimized, but it is to say we all can be victimized. And so I like what you said, which is, hey, have you heard of this? And that's one thing that fraudsters and folks who choose to perpetrate these sorts of crimes are banking on is that you're not knowledgeable. But it's funny. I talk about my parents who are older, and one thing my mom is always doing is telling me the next fraud or scam. She is much more attuned than I am, and she's having these conversations with her friends and her family and saying, "Hey, if your grandchild is calling from Mexico reporting they're in prison, it's probably not your grandchild," right? So it's using your community and your peers because peer to peer sort of engagement
Yeah.
is really going to be important. And I would be remiss if I don't say peer to peer support groups, where we work with the Cybercrime Support Network. And they have found that having folks who have experienced romance scams leading their peer to peer support group has helped other people. And so it's finding that network, finding those peers who may have also experienced it to help you navigate it so that we can help the next people.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is destigmatizing people when they've become a victim, like we talked about
Mm-hmm.
before, not calling them stupid and it was
Yes,
their fault, but realizing, hey, I think the more people that share their stories of having fallen victim for a romance scam, it just makes it easier for the next person to report it, easier for the next person to say, yeah, I was feeling the same things, I saw the same things happening, but I just kept going, or whatever the case was.
exactly. And language is important because, again, how we talk about these sorts of crime always puts it back on the victim.
Yeah.
But instead, we have to put the onus on the perpetrator. It's the person who chose to do it. I'm not going to say, well, this person got victimized. I'm going to say someone chose to perpetrate this against someone. We don't blame a robbery
Yeah.
victim for being robbed, do we? No. So this is the sort of, again, these sorts of crimes where we have to really come from it with an empowerment lens, and making it okay, making it safe for people to report, because the more people who report, the more we can track what's happening, and the more that these sort of crimes can go down, and people can get the recourses that they deserve.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that lacks in some ways is if law enforcement entities, whether it's federal, state, local, community, if they don't know that something's happening or how big the problem is, there's not a whole lot that they can do to stop it if no one's reporting it.
Exactly. And that's the thing about reporting, because I always say, when I do my trainings, I say report, and then I put a little caveat, because reporting could be to law enforcement, but it could be to another entity, because I recognize that reporting might not be safe for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so reporting could be to the match group if I'm experiencing a romance scam on one of their apps, right? Because they're going to take that data and they're going to collect it and go, we've seen this person being reported 5, 6, 100 times. Let's talk to our partners and see how we can do that. So it could be to them. It could be, like I said, the FTC, the Better Business Bureau. It could be that it's to your bank. A lot of banks are tracking this. And so there are a lot of really good options for victims and survivors. That doesn't necessarily mean that a criminal justice response has to happen.
Yeah.
For some victims, maybe they want a civil response. And I recognize, again, with that comes a privilege of having the funds to do so, but that is another option. And so my job is to make sure that victims and survivors recognize they have as many options as they want, and they can take as many options as they want.
Yeah.
They just have to know that those options are there. And so that's what makes having really good partnerships important. And so I encourage folks who might be doing this work to sit on their multidisciplinary team or their financial abuse, they're called FAST teams, where it's your judges, your bankers, your law enforcement, religious organizations, community organizations, because oftentimes your tattoo artist, like I said, your banker, your hairdresser, your broker, your financial broker, these are going to be the first people who are going to hear that a crime is happening.
Yeah.
And so making sure those folks understand what that crime could be is important as well. And so having the right partnerships is another piece to ensuring that victims and survivors get access to what they deserve.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I was talking to someone who, someone in their organization was convinced to change a bank account number on something, and so they ended up wiring money to a scam, or sending money to a scammer instead of the intended target. And they found out pretty quick that, like, oh wait, this was not, we sent the money to the wrong account. And they went and contacted the bank, who for the sake of the podcast, remain nameless, because
Yeah.
this is not that the specific bank is kind of irrelevant. And the person they talked to basically said, well, no one accessed the system illegally. No one committed they didn't do it. You intentionally sent the money. The fact that you sent it to the wrong account isn't our fault. And the person basically refused to transfer them over to the fraud department. And I was like, I was having this conversation. It's like, the bank needs better training. And like, yes, we understand that, like, according to our policy,
right,
we as the bank are not going to make you whole for this issue. But they should have at least said, let me get you over to the fraud department, who can contact the other bank and let them know that the receiving account is potentially involved in fraudulent transactions. So it was kind of like, I know our regulations and our process, and we're not going to make you whole. But there was no, like, let me try to help you while we can't make you whole. Maybe the receiving bank can. Let's get you connected with them and see if they can get the money out of that. Let's see if they can freeze the recipient account. Or do something before.
Yes. And we're actually working with the American Bankers Association on just that, because we recognize, again, that there is a difference, and I'll let the banker folks talk about that. But there's a difference between a scam and a fraud, and legally what
Yeah.
banks can do, right? And but that does not mean we cannot get people connected to resources or
Yeah.
get them connected to other help. And and again, I think that's where trauma informed processes come in place, because had that person stopped and said, okay, I recognize that this might be traumatic, and I also recognize I may not be able to help them, but I know somebody who can, or I can at least try to get them connected to the right people. And so that's sort of the work I've been doing with them, to say, okay, if a banker comes across this and they have someone who they're working with, because again, I mentioned my parents, they actually know their banker by name. I have yet to be in my bank in years, but their banker sees them once a week and will recognize if something is funny, right?
Yeah.
And so, how do we help them identify it and have some compassion, right? And have people understand that someone who loses their money, it's not even sometimes about the sort of physical pieces of that, but
Yeah.
there's an emotional context to that, and how someone might react in that situation could be aggressive or angry or sad, or all of the emotions. And so it's imperative for folks to recognize what those sort of things are. And so leading with a sort of trauma informed or person first
Yeah.
lens in whatever, sort of provider lens we're bringing is going to be important. And so you say that, and I remember working with a survivor recently where a similar situation happened. She was a victim of trafficking and financial fraud, and someone had opened accounts in her name, bought a car in her name, forged her signature. I mean, it was really dark. And it was one of those things where I'm like, oh my gosh, I've given her all of my resources and tools and strategies. I don't know what else to tell her. And I remembered I had a colleague who worked at a bank, and I called my colleague at the bank, and they said, oh, well, have you thought about this? And wait a minute, I sit on this work group. Can I share the non-personally identifiable informational pieces with the work group and see what the work group says? Well, the work group came back, and I had almost 2 pages worth of resources and
Wow.
strategies and tips, and all because I recognized I needed to bring in my partners in the space, and had reached out to another shelter, and had reached out to some folks at a loan organization. And we all sort of pooled our resources together for this survivor. And they were actually able to flee safely. And so I think about your story, and then I think about that story where we talk about how the system has failed folks.
Yeah.
And when I say system, I don't just mean criminal justice. I mean the institution of a system,
Yeah.
and how 2 people experiencing, these sorts of things have very different responses and outcomes.
Yeah. It's almost, we really need to, in the moment, think what is the best thing for this person at this time. And it may not be going to law enforcement. It may just be listening to them, being that shoulder that they can cry on, and some
Yes.
point in the future they'll feel comfortable going to the justice system for input or to report, and maybe that's not what they want at the time, but
Yes.
in
And
the
I think
moment.
that's so important about these sorts of crimes, because oftentimes people are sort of in disbelief that I couldn't have experienced it, or no, I don't know, I'm a little iffy. But when we start planting those seeds for them about, well, have you thought about this, or here's these resources, it may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but one of those days they're going to come back around. I actually, thinking about this, reminds me of a survivor I worked with many years ago, had to be 7 or 8 years ago. And recently I was at a conference and doing whatever. And I get this phone number from a number I don't recognize. And again, because I do fraud work, I'm like, I'm not going to answer it. But something in my spirit was like, no, answer it. This woman had saved my contact information from 7 or 8 years ago because I had provided her with services, right? And so those seeds had been planted. 7 or 8 years ago. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the satisfaction, and I think that's what oftentimes advocates we
Yeah.
struggle with, is we want the satisfaction of knowing someone was helped and they're safe and that they're no longer in that situation. But it, again, 7 to 9 times, right? It takes a person, they have to really want it for themselves. And all we can really do is continue to support them. So our support doesn't end after the first or second time. I support 7 or 9 times. And if it's a 10th time, I still support. And so it's really sort of building that relationship
Mm-hmm.
and building that connection with victims and survivors, especially when money is involved.
Yeah, and it's showing them that you care about them as a person, not that you're,
Yes.
I'm just here to get the stats from you and run along. But no, I want what's best for you. I want to help you. I want to participate in this process with you.
And there's been many survivors and victims I've worked with that I've given them the resources and they've made decisions and I wouldn't have made it for myself, but they're the expert in their lives and they know what
Yeah.
they, need to do. And I'm okay. I have to be okay with that. And I think that's one of the things, especially having worked on a hotline, that's one of the struggles I've always had was like, I want to make sure that the service that I've done, you are now safe, but we can't ensure that for them, but we can give them all of the resources. I talk about informed decision making. They need to be able to make informed decisions, and that informed decision could be a process.
Yeah. And as we wrap up here, are there any other specific, like, if you could tell the audience one more thing or two more things, what would it be?
Oh, can we just stay on the line? I'll say this: always have a strong password.
Yeah.
Make sure it's strong and make sure that you are never using the same password. Talk to your friends and family. If something seems too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. And know that there are resources and supports out there. The National Center for Victims of Crime is one of